talking about, we got into chapter 5 of the book of Ephesians, and I know we were talking about marriage and divorce, and we got into last week talking about what is written in the law and the difference between what Jesus says and what the law says. And we had to remind everyone that God of the Old Testament is also the God of what Testament?
New Testament.
The New Testament. So nothing's changed. What God's unchangeable. He doesn't change. What He wrote, He wrote. So it's in concrete. Our job is to rightly divide the Word to make it fit. If it says one thing here and one thing here, then there's something missing that links them together. And that's what rightly dividing the Word does. You don't try to make your thoughts fit, but you try to make the Word fit its thoughts and what it's saying. And so that's what we're doing. In Ephesians chapter 5, as we read down through there, we got down to where we were talking about in verse 22. 21, submitting yourselves one to another in the fear of God. Wives, submit yourselves unto your own husbands as unto the Lord. And so we dealt with the issue of how you get along in a family. How you get along in a family. First, it dealt with how you get along in a church. So the church is modeled after the family. God set that up that way. He used that in the Old Testament. He also uses it in the New Testament, as the Apostle Paul points out here in our text. And it tells us in verse 21, submitting yourselves one to another. That's God's church. So in God's church, we submit ourselves to each other. And so they have an anarchy. You have leadership in the church, and we're supposed to be submissive under our leadership. And that's how we get things done. Otherwise, you'd never get anything done in the church. You let the leaders make the final decision. And so you just submit unto whatever they choose to do, and that seems to be fine with me. And we let that go that way. So when we come to that point where we can't determine which way to go, we just let the leadership make the choice, and we all just kind of follow along. And it works like that. And then, after submitting ourselves one to another in the church, then it's wives, submit yourselves unto the husband, because that's the way God set it up in the beginning. And in the beginning, God gave the woman unto man. And then when they sinned, the curse that was placed on the woman is that she would have trouble, hard time in childbearing. It was going to be rough now. The man's curse was he would have to work from the sweat of his brow. And in that curse it was that he would rule over her. He would rule over her. So it's kind of like they were the same. And then God says, now we got division in the world. Now we're going to have some type of subordinate situation here. Some type of somebody's got to give in thing. And so it was the woman that was in transgression, but it was Adam that sinned. So the woman was deceived, but Adam did it willfully. And Adam did it for the woman. So Adam actually basically committed suicide. And that's what he did. God, if you're going to take my woman, I know what she did. I'm going with her. Give me that apple or whatever it was. I'll take it. And so he ate it too, because he thought that God was going to take her and he'd be left alone. He didn't want to be alone. That's why the Bible says it's not good for man to what?
Be alone.
It's not good for man to be alone. It's not a good thing. So he tells us here, as we read down, husbands, the husband's the head of the wife. That's the way God said it in the beginning. Even as Christ the head of the church, and he's the Savior of the body. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, So let the wives be their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. So you notice Paul reminds us that Christ gave himself for his church. Adam gave himself for his wife. And that's basically how this thing's set up. So we got in, we thought this is a good time to discuss marriage, and we got into discussing, that marriage is very important to God. God said he hates divorce. He just absolutely hates it. And he doesn't want anyone to get a divorce. I mean, that's not God's goal. And especially these people that think they can change, husbands and wives like you change clothes. I had this one long enough. We've been married 3 months. Good sakes, how long you supposed to put up with somebody, And more, they just go out and change husbands and wives like they're going out of style. And so Elizabeth Taylor, was she married 7, 8 times? So I know you got to quit somewhere. You can't make that many mistakes on marriage, can you? Well, I guess she did. I don't know. She must have. And sooner or later, you have to learn something, it seems like, about who should I marry, what's this going to happen? But, yeah, and that's one thing God's against. Now, he despises that kind of stuff, and it's not good. And he doesn't want anybody to get in that, so he makes a very strong case in here about staying married. And so, but then someone says, but what about these people? They just can't live together. And God's made a way for that also. And he calls that a written of divorcement. A written of divorcement. So even though God hates divorce, he's also given us a legal way out of it. A covenant of marriage is a legal document. We made a covenant. This is a binding agreement that we made with someone. In the nation of Israel, that covenant is made usually when you're a baby or even before you're born between families. This family covenants with this family about their daughter or their son marrying their daughter or their daughter marrying your son. And that covenant is made, and that covenant is not supposed to be broken, never. That's supposed to be, and that's supposedly is brought together through a lot of different things. Prayer, through trusting God, the sacrifices that were offered, things that were given to the altar for this covenant to be settled in heaven. And they trust that that's the covenant that God wants for them. And God gets angry when people belittle that. That's what we want to look at tonight. I want you to go back right now to Malachi chapter 2, and let's look at verse number 10. Malachi 2:10. And by the way, he's talking to, in Malachi, he's talking to the priest. Now, you think the common people would have problems. No, the priest also had problems. The religious hierarchy has as many problems as the common people do. And they also, in biblical days, started breaking their covenants. And God was upset with them for doing so. And if we read here in Malachi 2:10, have we not all one Father? Have not one God created us? Why do we deal treacherously? Now the word treacherously means to treat something sacred with irreverence or disrespect. And you got a sacred thing here, and we're going to be talking about the covenant that was made between the fathers. And that's a sacred agreement that was made, and they started treating this thing irreverently. They started treating it with disrespect, and it doesn't mean anything to them anymore. They were about to go do whatever they wanted to do. So he says, every man against his brother. So he says, why do you deal treacherously, every man against his brother, by profaning, and that word profane is an act of betrayal. By betraying an act of betrayal towards them, profaning the covenant of our fathers. And so we look at that word covenant, and with that there's a binding agreement that was made between parties. Two fathers got together and made this agreement for their family. And this agreement was that this would be the wife of their youth, this would be the husband of their youth, and when they grow up, these two would make a nice family, and so forth and so on. And by the way, I told you before, it's always about protecting the seed. They were trying to protect their bloodline. They did not want these people marrying outside of their own race, so they matched things up just the way God intended it, to protect that particular line for the nation of Israel. So it was important to them to obey God when it came to these things. And so we find here it said Judah, notice verse number 11. Judah has dealt treacherously, and an abomination is committed in Israel and in Jerusalem, for Judah has profaned the holiness of the Lord which he loved, and has married the daughters of a strange god. So what they do, they forsook the covenant that the wife they were covenant to in the beginning, and they turned their backs on her and went after someone else. And if you read in the New Testament, that's called adultery. When you leave your wife and cheat on her and go after someone else because she was the wife you're covenant to. And because of that, they were going out and getting strange wives, leaving these. They were committing adultery against her. And if she marries someone now, she's committing adultery because there's no legal document yet or involved that will actually divorce them. And until that legal document or that written of divorcement comes into the act, they're still married. They're still covenanted together, even though they're divorced. They're going their separate ways. Divorce means they're just separated. Separated. See, there's the word divorce, means separating, and there's a word written of divorcement, and that's legal divorce. Written of divorcement is you're not just separated, you're not married. You're legally, as far as God is concerned, as far as your government's concerned, you have nothing to do with each other anymore from this point on. You're not married to them. See, that's a legal document. So he says here in verse number 12, the Lord will cut off the man that doeth this, the master and the scholar, out of the tabernacle of Jacob, and him that offers the offerings unto the Lord of hosts. So God is angry about it, even to the point that he will throw these guys out of the service. He don't want them in his service. And it's the same way in God's church, by the way. If you're going to be a pastor, then you got to stay married to the woman you're covenant to. And if you run off of her and hook up with someone else, you are committing adultery. Amen. And you're supposed to be the husband of one wife if you're going to pastor a church. Amen. The husband of one wife. And if not, then God will boot you. He'll boot you. He don't have no need. He don't have any need for that stuff. And so he says, and this have you done again, covering the altar of the Lord with tears, weeping, and crying out, insomuch that he regardeth not the offering anymore, or receiveth it with good will at your hands. You see, God wasn't even accepting the offerings they were offering to him. They were basically, you ever heard somebody say, I'm just praying into the air, it's bouncing off the clouds, my prayers are going nowhere? That's the way these guys were. Nothing they were doing was going anywhere toward God. He was just sitting back like this. Why? Because he's grieved. You can grieve God, do you know that? Amen. God gets grieved, does that mean he hates you and he's going to run you off? No, that means he's hurt. And go ahead, do what you want, just like a spoiled little kid. Go do what you want. And he sits back. And he lets you go. And when you get yourself in enough trouble, what do you usually do? You find a place to get on your knees, don't you? And you begin to call out to God. God knows that. Verse 14 says, "Yet you say, wherefore? Because the Lord has been witness between thee and the wife of thy youth, against whom thou hast dealt treacherously. Yet is she thy companion and the wife of thy covenant?" Notice what the whole thing here that God was upset about was that they broke that covenant, that agreement that they made with their wives of their youth, and went out and took wives from strange gods, strange lands. You know, you're not supposed to marry out of your faith. Some people say, well, you know, they're Catholic, but they're Christian. Are they? They Christian like you are? They have the same standards you got? They serve the same God you do? They serve the same way you do. You see, what it affects, and it does in the church, is the seed. What's the seed? Your children. Now where's your children going to go to church? I'm a Baptist, she's a Catholic. Where's your children going to go? Catholic or Baptist? What kind of issues are they going to have? You see, so I tell people to stay in your own faith. If you get married in your own faith. Baptists, marry Baptists. Catholics, marry Catholics. You know, do that kind of thing. And you're going to find out life's going to be a lot easier for you. And that's the way it was back there. Israelis married Israelis of their own faith. Jews were Jews of the Jewish faith. And Jewish bloodline, they married them of their own faith. And when they married outside, they had problems. What did marrying outside do to Solomon? Let him sit up false gods, didn't he? He put up the high places, put in the groves. He did all those things because of his wives. They led him that way, you see. And you're always wanting to please your wife. And so you're going that extra mile and you're justifying as you go. Okay, I can go this step and I can do this. Yeah. And pretty soon you're deep in sin. You don't even realize it and you've gone too far. And God's like this. What are you doing? Are you finished? And that's the kind of thing you get yourself into. So here it says they were acting or dealt treacherously. They acted in betrayal and broke their agreement, their covenant, which was a legal contract or a lease or a legal deed. That's what covenants are. And they broke that thing. You know what the Bible tells us in Deuteronomy 23:21? In Deuteronomy 22, it deals with marriage. In Deuteronomy 24, it deals with marriage. In Deuteronomy 23, it throws this in here. And Deuteronomy 23:21, when thou shalt vow a vow unto the Lord thy God, thou shalt not slack to pay it. For the Lord thy God will surely require it of thee, and it would be sin in thee. So he's saying here, when I make a vow or I make a promise, I'm saying I'm going to do this, you and I shake hands, I'm responsible for keeping that vow. I'm responsible for fulfilling what I said to God, and God will require you to do so. Amen. He will? That's what the book says. I just believe the book. You know what it says in verse 23? That which is gone out of thy lips, thou shalt keep and perform, even a free will offering according as thou hast vowed unto the Lord thy God, which thou hast promised with thy mouth. I can tell you there's been many promises over the years that I've made with my mouth that I did not keep. I just thank God I live in the age of grace. And God sometimes, He just looks at me like, You said that and you didn't do it. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. When I was a teenager, I made a lot of promises to God. God, if you get me through this, I'll never do that again. I promise. I'll never, Lord. And the Lord gets me through it, and next week I'm what? Back out there doing it again. Doing it again. But God said it's a very serious thing when you make a vow and not keep it. So I wonder what that's cost me over the years. Or did God just say, okay, that's all right, that's fine? Or did he hold me to it? See, in the age of grace, God's just, it's like he'll let you get away with a lot. And it's not like back then when he held you to the letter of the law. But grace in this age, you get away with a ton. And he's such a gracious and loving God to us. And then he says that but if thou, in verse 22, but if thou shalt forbear to vow, that is, it's not sin unto thee. So if you don't make a vow, that's fine, you're all right, but when you do, you better keep it. You better keep it. That's what he says. But I'm sticking or saying that if it's good for the gander, it's good for the geese. There's a lot of things that we need to remember and keep in our soul, because if it wasn't a good thing, the Lord wouldn't have put it in there. Amen. So even though God might not hold you strict to the letter of this here in the Old Testament, it's something good you ought to put in your memory banks, that if you do make a vow, keep it. Put that in your memory banks. If you tell somebody you're going to do something, do it. If you tell someone you're going to be there on time, be there on time. All those things are important to God. They're important to God, and they're important to the church. It makes you look good when you keep your word. You keep your word. He tells us, and we're going to look at something here in a minute. God established marriage in the beginning, and we can go back, throw it on the screen back there, Genesis 2, 21 through 25. Genesis 2, 21 through 25. And we know back there, he took a rib, made the woman from the man's wound. He gave the woman unto the man, and he said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and these two shall be one flesh. Meaning that these who were twain is now one. And he called them Adam. He called them Adam. And it tells you that in God's eye, all he's seen was Adam. This is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. These two are one. And so God, that's the way it was in the beginning. Originally, it was one man for one woman for one lifetime. And if Eve got mad at Adam, she could not run back to Mama's house. Why not? Didn't have a mama. And Adam couldn't say, I'm going back home to Dad.
You don't have one.
Now you have to make it up there somehow, wouldn't he? His dad was God. You see, they had to work it out together, one man for one woman for one lifetime right here on this earth. That's the way God's original plan was. So we talk about what? We talk about a perfect will and a permissive will. The perfect will of God is to get married and stay that way forever. It's important to God. That's the only way you'll ever have anything. That's the only way your children are going to be grown up, very balanced, and all those things they need with that, both mother and father, and all the things they need in their life from a healthy family. Those things are important to God, and they're important to you. But there's a permissive will. There's a time. There's people. I've dealt with people. I can tell you. There's been people in my office that should not be married. They hate each other's guts. I mean, they'd cut each other open if they thought they'd get away with it. Those people should not be married. And there's people going through things where their wives are doing things to them, and their husbands are doing things to them, and these things are awful things, and they're trying to tolerate it and put up with it. But I'm telling you, those people probably should not even be married. It would be like being married to the devil. And our God is such a gracious God that He says, yeah, this is perfect will. And this is what you ought to do. But I'm going to permit you to do something else if it comes to that point. So there's a perfect will. The Pharisees in Matthew 19 and verse number 3. Let's read both of them real quick. Matthew 19 and verse number 3. The Pharisees also came unto him, tempting him, saying unto him, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause? Now notice he didn't just say for adultery or fornication. He didn't say that. You see, those were things you could put away your wife for if she was committing fornication before you ever came together, but she's the covenant wife that you're covenant with from your youth. But before you ever come together, she's messing around with other guys. You don't have to marry her. He just put her away. You go on. That's why Joseph was going to put away Mary privately. You know, here's the woman he's covenanted to marry from his youth. And they get to that age of marrying, and boy, she comes up pregnant. And what do? Well, what have you been doing, Mary? Nothing, Joe. I ain't been doing a thing. Explain that one. If God hadn't intervened there, go ahead, Fred.
I read a week or so ago where I can't remember where I read it. Mary was 12 to 14 years old when Jesus was
Probably.
born, and Joseph was in his 90s.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'd say Mary was about 14.
They said that was the average age, 12 to 14 for a woman.
Yeah.
But Joseph was in his 90s.
I don't know about Joe being in his 90s. I don't know how old Joe was, really. I couldn't tell you. Josephus might say something about it. You might be able to read in a historical book to find it. I never looked it up. But 90, that seems awful old for 14. I don't know if they would have coveted that difference. Unless, a lot of times wealthy, if he'd have been wealthy, he could take, sometimes they would take these girls just to give them a home because they didn't have a place to go. So that could have been, in that case, you could be any age. Like Solomon had 1,000 wives. You know, you got to remember, I know we look at Solomon in a sexual way, 1,000 wives. What's he need with 1,000? But you got to look at it like this. He was king. He sent men, soldiers, you know. All these soldiers his dad had sent out to fight. And all these husbands that were killed, what are we going to do with all these women? And Solomon said, I'll take them in. So he had 800 concubines or whatever it was. He took them in, you know. He just gave them a place, took care of them, so forth and so on. So, let's read on. So he says, for every cause. Didn't Moses write in there you could get a written of divorcement for every cause? Yeah, he put something in there. It said, you know, because the hardness of a man's heart. You know, because there's something, sometimes you come to the point where you just cannot survive any longer. And he said this. Notice how he answered. He answers with God's perfect will. He says this. Now, verse 3 shows you God had a permissive will. He allowed a written of divorcement. And for just about any cause. And he said this, in 19:4 he says, and he answered and said unto them, have you not read that he which made them in the beginning made them male and female? and said, For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and these twain shall be one flesh. So these two become one. Verse number 6, Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no man put asunder. Perfect will. God brings you together. If you really trust God, you can trust God that that's the woman, even before she's born, that you're going to marry. God's going to make that happen. God brings that together. And if you come from a Christian family, your family prays for you, prays for your mate, you can almost bank on you got the right woman. Quit looking. You got the right man. You don't have to look any further. They've already prayed about it. God set it up, worked it out. You tried someone else. They dumped you. They cheated on you. Because it wasn't the right person. But finally you met that one. And that's the one the Lord wanted for you. And that's how it works. Perfect will. You get that woman, you're together, you want to stay together forever and ever and ever and ever. That's the way God set it up in the beginning. But now look at the permissive will. Look at verse number 7, what the Lord says. Well, here's what they said. Look at this. They said unto him, Why did Moses then command to give her a written of divorcement and put her away? He said unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives. But from the beginning it was not so. So Moses comes in, and God says to Moses, Moses, there's going to be that situation. Put this in there. There is such a thing as a binding document that will set you free, and you can be free from the wife of your covenant, and she can be free from you. If the situation ever occurs, then there's a provision put in the law to protect them. Now, how would you like to be married to someone, covenanted to someone, and find out that he was an axe murderer or she's a cannibal? You just got in some situations where, it'd just be impossible to live with. And you think God's going to make you stay there. You think this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. He's put me in prison. Why'd God do that to me? I don't know why. Well, maybe he didn't. Sometimes we get ourselves, by getting out of the will of God and doing things on our own, we get ourselves in trouble. Now, notice what verse number 9 says. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife except to be for fornication, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And whosoever marries her which is put away commits adultery. Now notice what he said now. Notice it very carefully. If any man puts away his wife, he commits adultery. And if any woman puts away her husband, she commits adultery. Or she causes them, if they get married again, to commit adultery. But what's missing here? Written of divorcement, see? A written of divorcement. You can't just leave your wife. You can't just leave your husband. But you can have a legal document, a written of divorcement that says you're no longer married. And then back in Deuteronomy 24, verse number 4, what's it say? That's where you have to go. You go to Deuteronomy 24. Oh, wait a minute. Deuteronomy 24. Put it on the screen, Clay, if you find it. Deuteronomy 24. Verse number 4. I think it is. Might be 3. Don't hold me to it. I am not. Everybody heard Jack Van Impe, Pastor? Huh? Everybody heard Jack Van Impe.
Everything starts at verse 1. All that. Deuteronomy 24.
24, yeah. So when a man has taken a wife, look at verse number 1, and married her, and it comes to pass that he finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorcement and give it into her hands and send her out of his house. That's the legal way that you can separate. Verse number 2 says, and when she is departed, notice this now, out of his house, she may go, somebody read it, and be another man's wife. Now, it doesn't call her an adulterer or an adulteress or anything, does it? No. So do you think God made a mistake in the Old Testament or the New Testament? Neither one. So we have to find out what the difference is, and the difference is that written of divorcement. When that written of divorcement is present, you're no longer married. You're no longer legally married to anybody. And to tell somebody that they have to go back to their first wife, you need to be court-martialed. Because notice what it says, verse number 3. And if the latter husband hate her, the one she marries again, and writes her a bill of divorcement, meaning, yeah, it can happen. You could get 2 bill of divorcements. And give it in her hands and send her out of his house. Or if the latter husband die, which took her to be his wife, then verse 4, her former husband which sent her away may not take her again to be his wife. So God said, no, once you've been legally divorced, once he's given you a written of divorcement, once you've been somebody else's wife, don't even think about coming back because he's not allowed to take you back. Because you've been defiled. And that's how germs and diseases get started. And back then they didn't have antibiotics and penicillins and any of those things, so they had to use caution. So they used laws to govern their diseases. And that's how they kept it clean. So God said, you give her a written divorce or send her out of your house, she can go be another man's wife. Here he says, if you're separated from her and you cause her to commit adultery, and if you marry someone else, you committed adultery. Yeah, that's if you just separated from her. You just divorced from her without legally giving a written of divorcement. Now let's read the next verse. We're talking about permissive will. Verse number 10. Now this really upset the disciples. They didn't know what to do. His disciples said unto him, if the case of a man be so with his wife, is it not good to marry? So what's he saying? He's saying if that happens to us, and we have to give our, we have to divorce from our wife. Is it good if we don't marry? I mean, what are we supposed to do? Notice the answer in verse number 11. But he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. Why? Because there's men that need wives because it's not good for man to what? Be alone. He needs a wife. A lot of fellas need wives. They don't work good. They don't function good. Nothing happens good with them because it's not good for them to be alone. They don't function good that way. So because of that, he says this, but he said unto them, all men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. In other words, good to stay unmarried. That way you give all your time to the Lord's work. You don't have to worry about pleasing your wife. You don't have to worry about what time you're going to be home, what time we're going to do this. We got to go see mom. We got to go shopping for the kids. We got to do this, that, and that. No, you give your time to the Lord. If you can stay unmarried, then stay unmarried is what he's saying. And serve the Lord. And it's good also for the virgin that she can stay unmarried. That's what Paul says in Corinthians. It's a good thing. That way they can give their time to the Lord's service and not worry about earthly things. He says this to explain it in verse number 12. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb. Now everybody know what a eunuch is, right? See, that's someone that don't need a sexual partner. They have no need of it. They have no desire for it. They put that aside. You can become a eunuch 3 ways. I'm going to read them to you. There are some eunuchs that were born of their mother's womb. You can be born that way. Well, you have no desire for the opposite sex. And he says, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men. In other words, if you were going to be in the queen's court or taking care of princesses or something of that nature, they would make you a eunuch. My wife made my puppy one. Poor thing. He ain't been the same since. He's talking like this. He's got a real high voice now. I don't know. It's pretty funny. Says this. Some are born from their mother's womb. There are some eunuchs which are made eunuchs of men. That's the one we were just talking about. And there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. Otherwise, they're self-made. They just flat deny themselves any relationship of the opposite sex. And that's what Catholic priests claim they do. But you and I, we have problems with that. So we find here that, they do that for the kingdom of heaven's sake. So one day when the kingdom of heaven comes in, they're wanting to rule and reign in that kingdom of heaven in certain positions, and they'll give all their time and efforts to that kingdom. But he said this, he that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So if you can stay unmarried, then this saying's for you. You can go ahead, and you want to be a eunuch, go ahead and be one. If you can receive this, you can. But what Paul write in Corinthians? If you can't contain, it's better for you to marry than to, everybody knows this, burn. It's better to marry than to burn. Let's go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 7. 1 Corinthians chapter 7. See, men have, like I said, it's not good for them to be alone. Because when they do, they're going to have issues with eyes, with lust, issues with, desires inside, burnings. And because of that, the Apostle Paul says, whoa, you don't need to go around like that. Now, the first thing what Paul's doing in Corinthians here is he's answering questions that people had wrote to him about issues, and this issue was about marriage and divorce. And he starts out in the very first verse, he says, now concerning the things whereof ye wrote unto me, is it good for a man not to touch a woman? And when I was youth director, I used to tell my kids, you don't touch her. We had a 6-inch rule. You had to sit 6 inches away from each other. You didn't sit there and touch each other. Why can't we touch? Because touching is never enough. Just touching an opposite sex will never be enough. That touching leads to what? Patting. Patting leads to what? Kissing. Kissing leads to what? Don't say it. That's how it works. You see, touching will never be enough, so it's good for a man not even touch a woman. Stay as far separated as you can. Walk separated, talk separated. Once you start touching, you're in trouble. Something about touching. It also says, nevertheless, in verse number 2, to avoid fornication. What's fornication? Sex outside of marriage. To avoid having sex outside of marriage, let every man have his what? Have his own wife, you see. And let every woman have her own husband. You see, to avoid that, every man should have his own wife, every woman should have her own husband, and that takes care of those problems. And when you get married, realize that you're married because those needs exist. If it wasn't for those needs, you probably wouldn't have came together. And I can read through the whole New Testament, and this is the only reason I've ever seen in the New Testament that the apostle said you should get married for. He never said you ought to get married to have kids. He never said you ought to get married to have a home. You ought to get married to gain wealth in the world, or you ought to get married to build a future, or any of those things. And all those things are good, but that's not the one and number one reason that a person ought to get married. You get married so you don't mess around outside of marriage. Because when you read down here, and I could read on down, but we ran out of time. It's time to quit. But they talk about not defrauding one another, and it's in those issues, those same issues. You don't want to defraud them. You need to, your body's not yours, her body's not hers. Those needs are there and they're real. You need to take care of them. You take care of your husband, you take care of your wife. All those things. You know what your wife needs, and she knows what you need. You need to take care of those things because there's incontinencies in your body, things you can't control, uncontrollable desires, and you're going to fulfill those somewhere. If you don't fulfill them with each other, where are you going to fulfill them? You're going to get hooked on pornography? Huh? You're going to be down at the strip club? You don't have someone at work you're going to hook up with? You see what I'm saying? It happens. So we get down, he says, in verse number 7, for I would that all men were even as I myself, but every man has his own proper gift of God. And he's talking about himself because Paul, though I think Paul's wife was dead, he was a widower, the way he talks about him. There's a few things to the Bible. But he stayed unmarried. So whether he'd been married before or whether or not I think he was, he stayed unmarried. And he said that it's good if every man would stay that way and give all their time to God, but men are not going to. And he says, one after this manner, another after that. I say, therefore, unto the unmarried widow is good for them if they abide even as I, and he refers to the widows, even as him, that they would abide like he is. But if they cannot contain, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. So you're going to burn with lust inside of you, and it's awful to sit around and lust after some desire that you have that could be fulfilled if you just find someone to get married to. All you have to do is go out on visitation with me. I'll get you married. Okay, the perfect will then of God is get married, stay married, and never leave them. A good marriage requires what? Falling in love many times, but always with the same person. Did you hear that? You have to do it. You're not always going to feel that fluttery, you know what I'm saying? Like those feelings you had when you were dating and you first met and all that. Those things go away. Now it's just real life. It's commitment. God's not going to tell you to do something you can't do. When he tells you to love one another, that means you can love one another. And it's also with man and wife. When you can love your wife, you make that commitment in your life and you stick to it. And every day of your life, you prove it over and over and over and over again. And then ladies, you reverence your husbands. You reverence them. And that is every time, you make them feel good. You make them feel special. all those kind of things. And because you're doing that, they love you more and more and more and more. And that's how marriage works. Don't think you're going in there saying, I think I'm the boss. I'm the boss here. That's not what marriage is. A good marriage, you don't know who's in control. You can't tell. Is he running things? She running things? I don't know. They're running things. You'll see how it works. And that's the way it works. All right, we're going to stop here. Promise next week we're not going to talk about that. We're going to move on. And we're going to get through chapter 5. So I just thought I needed to bring that out and finish that for clarity, and so that folks will get a good understanding of what the Bible's all about. I know there's a lot of strange teaching out there, and there's some people would have you in bondage all your life and telling you can't do this, you can't do that, God's going to damn you to hell and burn you in flames if you do that. But no, God's not. He's gracious and loving God. He's made a way for us. He wants to protect you, and He wants to protect that woman. And that's His main goal. And it's more about her than it is about you. And so He watched out for her, because men, they had a way they could make living, so forth and so on. In biblical times, we're going back there in the law. You get back there, you'll find women did not have the same opportunities to fend for themselves as men did. So somebody usually had to take responsibility. And usually it was either her father she went back to. If he wasn't available, it was her oldest brother. He would take her in, take care of her. And then one of the kinsmen, you read the story of Ruth, could claim her as their wife. So, and then take her in. So, and that could come about. But anyway, that's the way marriage works. Any questions? Anybody getting a divorce? Okay, I'm just checking. I need something to preach on Sunday. I'm getting some good gossip here. Nothing good? Okay. You're sick. Tell me something. I hear it coming. Okay. No discussion? Nobody got anything? Okay, then we're going to quit right here. Let's have prayer. Our Father, we love you. God, we need you so much in our lives. We need you so much this day, God, the trying times, the wickedness of our world. Lord, I wake up in the morning, I feel like the world's been turned upside down. Good is evil, evil is good. I've never seen such a wicked time. People have such a wicked vision about what love is and what it means, and Lord, how you look at the world in love. And Father, we ask, God, that you'd help us have a clear understanding of these things. Help us have a clear understanding of what you're doing in this world. And God, we wait on your imminent return. We're here and looking up, knowing you could come at any minute. We're waiting on you. Love you tonight. We need you to watch over our church and our church family, and our family and friends, God. Our sick that were prayed for the night, Lord. And this night, God, touch them right now, even as we pray. Heal their needs, and Lord, get their bodies working, and remove the ugliness from their flesh, Lord, that's hurting them or killing them. God, just remove it. Let them get around. Let them enjoy what time they have. Let them enjoy their families. And Lord, we love you, and we need you now. Keep us safe. Bring us back Sunday. Lord, make us prosper. We might share with you. And we thank you for all in Jesus'